In this video, I'd like to consider how not to read like a Christian fundamentalist. And I'd like to add that I'm not only talking about reading here, I'm also talking about any consumption of popular culture. It could be watching a movie or listening to a song. To begin with, I'd like to go back to the year 2007. That's the year that Paul Young wrote his book, The Shack. It was a theological novel, so it explores aspects of theology and suffering through the framework of a novel. And recognizing that this was a popular book, in fact, it went on to sell tens of millions of copies, I wrote a response to it in 2009 called Finding God in the Shack, which attempted to explore theology by using the Shack as a platform to do so. I then went on something of a book tour and did many radio interviews with respect to Finding God in the Shack. One of them was with a conservative radio host in the United States who expressed his concerns about the Shack, and he did so by way of a culinary analogy. He said, well, Professor, if reading the book is like baking a cake. If there's a little bit of poop in the batter, you're not going to want to eat any of the cake. The implication being, apparently, that if there's something you disagree with in the theology of the Shack, you're not going to want to read any of the book. Now, I tried to push back at him and say, well, that's just not an appropriate analogy. It's a false analogy. It's poisoning the well by suggesting that reading a book is an all or nothing affair, that either you must agree with all of it or with none of it. You can't engage with any of it at all. And I would say that is often the way that fundamentalists think about popular culture, whether it's reading books, watching movies, or listening to a song, that if there's anything you disagree with morally or theologically, then you can't engage with any of it. Unfortunately, I didn't have another analogy to give him in the moment, but a few weeks later, I mentioned that cake analogy, which I should mention I've encountered often among conservative or fundamentalist Christians. I mentioned it to another fellow that was doing a radio interview, and he was a Southerner, and he says, now, Professor, I don't think that reading a book is like eating a piece of cake. I think it's like eating a piece of fried chicken. When you eat the chicken, you eat the meat and you leave the bone. And I said, exactly. That's the culinary analogy that is appropriate. When you read a book or when you listen to a song or watch a movie, you eat the meat and you leave the bone. But to think in an all or nothing affair, that's how you read like a fundamentalist. To read critically, to eat the meat and to leave the bone, well, that is how not to read like a fundamentalist.